So hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's podcast. Here today, of course, myself, Jackie, and my father, Michael, and we are looking at chapter 3, and we're doing the episode of part 2 of the Bhagavad Gita. So welcome, and straight over to you, Michael.
Oh, that was a quick introduction, Jackie. Hello to you, and a big hello to all of our listeners. So I'll launch straight into it, Jackie. We'll finish off the chapter 3 in this podcast. So to begin this session, I'd just like to give a quick revision, Jackie, of what we covered in last week's podcast, where I started on chapter 3 of the Gita, titled "The Yoga of Action" or Karma Yoga. By beginning his teachings in earnest with the topic of action, Krishna is now indicating to Arjuna, that's us, of course, how important this aspect is in our everyday lives. We're constantly acting, Jackie, every human being, one way or another, even when we're asleep. We could be having dreams, but our hearts are beating, our blood's flowing, the lungs are working. So there's some sort of action there taking place, even though basically we're inactive and are asleep. If we're having dreams, well, there's some activity taking place in the mind, obviously. It's only in a deep sleep state that we're truly inactive. But in the course of our everyday lives, we're either acting physically or we're acting through our emotions or we're acting through our mind. So the physical, mental and emotional actions are what people are performing all throughout the course of every day of their lives. So it's a very important aspect of our life. And because it's so important, obviously, we need to, the reason that a lot of people get themselves into, some sort of pickle in any stage of a day or in any stage of their life is because they're not understanding how they're acting mentally, physically or emotionally. So this teaching is explaining to us via the teachings to Arjuna how we need to act, suggesting or giving advice as to how to act appropriately so that we can lead happier and more enjoyable lives. So he goes on to, so it's an important aspect of our everyday lives, action. We need to come to understand why we act as we do, and he suggests better alternatives for us. He reminds him that action is not only physical and sensory, but it's also constantly taking place, that's what I've just mentioned, in his mind and his emotions. He explained that human beings fall into two categories. We covered this last week briefly. There was the introverts, who, being contemplative, follow the path of knowledge. That's people really like us who are having these discussions and wanting to study this material, our listeners. And he says, and there's extroverts who, naturally being inclined to action, follow the path of action. Now, obviously, we're at this stage of our journey, or all stages of our journey, end up being both. We can be studying and wanting to learn this knowledge, but we're also acting. But the difference is that we're starting to, when we understand it more, we start to use the knowledge to change how we act physically, mentally, and emotionally. So that's why it's such an important topic. And he says, so that was reference to the extroverts and the introverts. And then he referred last week to the twofold path, which is really one path, but it's got two, but caters for both of those types of people, the introverts and the extroverts. It caters for both the active, who are fully engaged in worldly affairs and have many desires, and they're at an earlier stage on their spiritual journey. Some even don't know they're on the spiritual journey, but nevertheless they still are, but fully immersed in the activities of the world. But he goes on to say that and so that's most people who are at this extroverted stage. And he says the contemplative, who have fewer desires and are further advanced in their spiritual journey, and that's people, like I say, like ourselves in these situations, and they're much fewer in the world. Notice the connection, Jackie, between actions and desires, because this is a whole chapter on action, but it explains clearly as I go on the topic today that all those actions are driven by desires. So desires is I referred to that last week, and I'm going to expand on that fully this week. Desires are a critical aspect of what's driving all of our actions. So anything you'd like to add in here, Jacqui, or?
Yes, well, a thought just came to mind. I'm thinking of a few people I know, and it occurs to me that those listening may also know people like this in lives. And
Yeah.
this is by no way to make judgment of people. It's more an observation. But I'm thinking that in life, I've met, and we all probably know, people who we describe that they don't know themselves very well, in that they're very inconsistent in their behavior or their responses, so that people who are more aligned, I suppose, are a little bit more predictable. You think, okay, if you're aligned and you're connected, you tend to respond to different things in life in similar ways because you're really aware, you're checking in deeply, and you're much more conscious in terms of how you're responding. This is probably a little sideways comment, but just as you were speaking, it just made me think that there's so many people in life that are not necessarily consciously on the journey to, know thyself, but it's almost the exact opposite. They so don't know who they are and how they respond in life that you sort of get this very higgledy-piggledy, messy approach, which, again, this is the part where I don't mean judgment, it's observational, but it looks really uncomfortable. It looks sad. And look, we've all been there and we all still are. I think I know myself very well in life, but there's still times where I'm like, oh, why did I behave that way? Or why did I respond that way? Yeah, it's not so much a question, it's more just a comment that I
Yeah,
think we
yeah.
all see this sort of people, or we know it within ourselves, and it's not always appealing. We like to be more consistent in our response. We like to know why we're responding and interacting with the world in a particular way.
Yes, well, again, you've touched on it very nicely, Jacqui, and it's like what you're really saying there is that there is a huge difference between judging and observing. And these days, even I get labelled at different times that I'm being judgmental when I try and explain that I'm merely observing the behaviour or what's happening to a person or within a person or within society and so on. So there's a huge difference between the two. Observing is part of what is a critical part of this teaching and this understanding. We need to observe constantly ourselves, and when we're observing ourselves, we observe other people as well. And it's not in a judgmental way. It's just to see clearly what you're describing, Jacqui. And you made the reference that they look a bit unhappy or a bit confused or a bit unsettled or that. Well, that's exactly what most people on the planet are going through. And it's because they don't have this knowledge. They don't have this understanding, and they'll keep muddling around, and it's inevitable. It's part of the divine plan. So I'm not being critical. Krishna's not being critical. He's just explaining what's happening in the world as it is happening. He knows what's happening, and he's explaining it to Arjuna so that he can at least work on himself and try and make the changes within himself. So what you're
Yes.
seeing is from a more advanced seeker, the introvert part of you is observing others that are operating more from their extrovert part. Now, it's neither good nor bad in the sense that it is what it is. There's a reason why all the people are doing and saying and acting the way they are, which will come out over these podcasts. And I'll touch on it a fair bit in this one as well. But it's a lot to do with karma, or our USB stick that I referred to a week or two ago. The karma, the computer program, no longer USB sticks, memory sticks, or whatever. I'm always about 50 years behind in whatever the current sort of technology is, but I think everyone understands. So inside, we're all programmed, and that program drives us. And you say, well, why are they saying this? Why are they doing this? Well, it's because of that program. I'm going to touch on that right now in the next few lines, but it's lovely that you brought it up, because you're describing in those few sentences, you described in your own words the introverts and the extroverts without using those words. But that's what you were talking about. Lovely. So he says, it goes on to say that I go on to say that a significant aspect of karma, yoga, which is action, is then outlined to Arjuna. So Krishna tells him that no one can remain inactive in this world. We touched on that earlier on. He says you must act. So everyone must act one way or another. Nature will drive you, what's called the three gunas, but also your desire aspect in you, your USB stick, will drive you because you all want to achieve or run away from those desires. Their positive desires are both positive and negative. The good ones we just simply call desires. The negative ones we call aversions. So we're either running after one or we're running away from the other one. Either way, we're just constantly running. Had a lady one day in the group many years ago, elderly lady, and asked her why she joined the group, and she just said in a voice that was almost in total exhaustion, "I'm tired of running." And she was just glad to hear an explanation like that. She realised in those next few minutes when I explained it that all her life she was an extrovert and she was running after things constantly, her desires, and she was running away from the ones she didn't like. People she didn't like, places she didn't like, all of that. And this is what every human being on the planet's doing. It's constant movement backwards and forwards from what you're chasing and what you're running away from. And it exhausts us and it takes its toll. We become exhausted physically, we become exhausted mentally and emotionally and so on. And in that confused state, we make terrible mistakes in our lives and affect others and so on. And I'll show a diagram in the next 10 minutes or so that'll show that sort of quite clearly. So he goes on to say, he says, no one can remain inactive in this world. You must act. Your own personalities based on your desires, together with the gunas, these are the three universal energies, and they're sort of not really known at all in our Western culture, but they'll be explained in more detail, a whole chapter on the gunas later, but I'll refer to them as we keep on going. But just a brief mention needs to be made here. So it's not just our own internal desires, but all of the universal forces are working to bring all this into balance and into the way it should all work out. So he says your own personalities, your own desires with the gunas will force you to act. He then explained last week, we looked at the reference to the sacrificial action. Was then that the sacrificial action, Jackie, was the best way for people, for human beings to act physically, mentally and emotionally. And this is a very new concept for a lot of our listeners. And even the ones who have got some understanding of it will end up needing to be a deeper understanding, obviously, as we go along. So he says that it was through sacrifice that the entire creation came into existence. So there's a reference that God himself sacrifices his aspect to bring about the creation and continue running it in a constant effort. So in that sense, it said he says, I'm constantly acting. And we went on to look at the fact that Krishna mentions that if we merely take from the creation without ever giving back, then very verily he is a thief. So he's saying for people who don't give back to the universe, to the creator, their actions or their whole life really, in a sacrificial aspect, they're a thief. They're just taking from the creation, but not contributing to it. And again, I'll be touching on that in the following few minutes then. So we finished there. This is last week's podcast that I'm revising, with the understanding that we all have a choice on how we live our lives. Do we want to act according to divine law in the now, with no egoic mental or emotional attachments, for the benefit and welfare of yourselves and for all concerned? Or do you want to continue acting with your egoic desire-based motives with limited results? And it limits yourself as well, and it limits anyone you come in contact with in all of those activities that are taking place. So the choice is quite clear, and simply it's that choice that you outlined, Jackie, a few podcasts ago when you gave the story of the two wolves. Yeah, one was a mean and angry and greedy wolf, and the other one was a kind, gentle, considerate wolf. So this is the battle that we keep talking about that's taking place. We're now using words more sort of growing upwards, if you like, the ego and the buddhi, the lower self and the higher self. And this is the constant battle through all of our lives, and it's the theme that runs through the entire teachings of the Gita. A constant new knowledge and encouragement and examples illustrations as to why we need to shift and how it'll be useful for not only ourselves, but for every other human being, but even the biggest picture of all will be giving back to the entire creation. So it's a big sort of ask in a sense. And I'll mention this, but I'll leave it till I get to it in a few minutes. So at this point, Jacqui, I'll just want to recount a short story from the East. And they have the Indians in the East have a lovely way of using stories to illustrate some of these, important sort of sounding aspects that can be quite hard to get your head around. But a little simple story makes it a lot easier to understand. And I'm paraphrasing here, so pardon me when I'm and ahhing and everything, but it's only a short story. But it involves a king, Jacqui, from ancient India, and he realised he needed to have seeking some advice from wise people to help make decisions in how to rule his kingdom and so on. Similar to that aspect of the temple at Apollo where the oracle lived, and people went there for advice in ancient Greece. So that sort of story is all through the teachings. So he became, his advisors told him that there were two groups of wise men in the kingdom, and he didn't know which group to seek advice from. So he devised a plan where he invited both groups of wise men to come to the palace to have a banquet, join in a banquet. And when they got there, they were told, well, part of the deal was that they had to put on these specially made jackets that were people there ready to hand them out to each person. And the significance of these jackets, Jacqui and listeners, is that inside the sleeves were sewn in strips of bamboo, long strips from the shoulder down to the wrist. And so it meant when the people put the jackets on and they had their arm in there, they couldn't bend the arm at the elbow. You understand, Jacqui? Just
yes.
So they're stiffed arm. And he had two banquet rooms, huge banquet rooms, and he sent one group of wise men into one room and the other group of wise men in the other room. And he said to both groups, well, enjoy your meal and that, and I'll come back in about half an hour, 45 minutes and that, and see how you're all making out. And the groups went in and they were delighted. They looked around and there were tables laden with all of the most majestic food and tasty food and little samples and main courses and sweets and everything. You can see I'm almost salivating. I'm just, because I love food, Jacqui. I'm thinking I'm there at this banquet. Anyway, away they go. And he comes into one room after the time, 45 minutes, an hour or something. And as he opens the door, there's this terrible noise. There's anger and shouting and yelling, and there's frustration, and and he looks around, and there's food everywhere. It's all over the table. It's all over the floor. It's over the people's faces, and they're yelling and shouting, and they're angry with each other, and they're angry with the other people because they've got all this beautiful food and they can't eat it. Some were trying to flick it onto the table and lean over and lick it off the table. And some were throwing it up in the air and putting their faces up, and trying to catch it, and food splattering all over them and all the rest of it. And so they were frustrated. They wanted that food desperately, but they couldn't get it because their arms were locked in. So anyway, the king just shook his head, walked out and shut the door behind him. And he walked across the hallway into the other banquet room. And in there, as soon as you open the door, there was laughter and there's cheerfulness and there's happiness and there's joy. And he walks in and the food's half eaten and there's no mess everywhere. Everyone's laughing and giggling and having a great time, and they're chewing away and they're happy. And he looks and he sees what's taking place. And what he saw was that each person realised they couldn't feed themselves. So they're holding out their stiff arm with food that the other person indicated they wanted, and they were feeding their mouths. They were putting the food into their mouths. And the other person, in reciprocating, was doing the same to them. So they were all eating, they were all happy. They couldn't feed themselves, but by feeding other people, they got fed in return. So can you understand, Jacqui? It's a beautiful, simple little story, but this is where one group's totally egoic. I want to eat this food. It's mine, and I want it, and so on. And even though they can't get it, they still try desperately to get it. Whereas the other half, the other group, they understood this concept of sacrificial action. This is serving someone else. And in the doing of that, naturally, it comes back to you as well. So you give the food to the other person, they'll very quickly cotton on. Well, if it wasn't for you feeding them, they wouldn't be fed. And it doesn't take much imagination to realise. Yeah. So simple story, Jackie, but as I say, the Indians have a wonderful way of describing these more complex sort of ideas. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I'm just thinking it's very beautiful, and you often meet people who do volunteer work in different capacities in their local
Yes, yeah,
communities.
yeah.
And it's not uncommon that people will say the reward they get, it feels as much, if not more, as what they're giving or contributing. So I think a lot of people who either do volunteer work or know people who do can relate to that as well, that there's a lovely sense in making that contribution.
Well,
Beautiful.
yeah, and I'll just even bring it home to every person that's listening to this podcast, and applies really to nearly just about everyone on the planet. At one stage or another in your lives, you've all done something which comes under this example of sacrificial action. You haven't had nothing to do with you. You just saw or were in a situation where something needed to be said or done or whatever. Give someone a hug, say a nice word, pick up, help a person who's fallen over, anything like that. Everyone's done that. You don't have to have all this knowledge, because that's part of our natural nature. This is one of the things that's going to come out in all of this teaching, that's our true nature. That's how we should be doing it all the time. But the point I'm wanting to make, which is just following on the one you've made, Jackie, is that you all can relate clearly the feeling that arises in you when you've performed an action according to the divine law. No ego, no nothing. What's in it for me? Am I going to get a reward, or is this or that? You just do it. And in the doing of it, there's an enormous amount of inner satisfaction that arises from that. And that's how the divine plan works. That's how it's meant to work. We're just going to, through more knowledge and making changes in our lives, more and more act in that way, and have that same feelings in our jobs, in our relationships with husbands and wives and families, and the community, and all of society. It's a beautiful feeling that that develops within the being as they start more and more operating from their higher self as against their selfish, egoic lower self. All good, Jackie?
All good.
All good. I'll continue on. So I mentioned briefly a few minutes ago about the whole creation bringing, or the whole creation come into existence through the sacrifice of the Lord, or the consciousness, or this higher aspect that we know. Krishna now continues with the reference to what's called the wheels of life, where he explains to Arjuna how the entire creation came about through sacrificial action by the Supreme Spirit. Whole creation came about from this. Yeah. So in other words, there is a creator, and there is a creation, and we're all part of it. And that spiritual aspect flows through everything. It's what runs it all. It's like electricity. It powers everything in the entire creation. And that if we as humans do not help this universal revolving wheel of sacrifice, we breathe in vain. So he's saying clearly there, Jackie, that the highest source has brought all this about. And if we don't likewise contribute to it in our lives, well, we're in a sense wasting our lives. And goes on to say that, put more simply, Krishna's telling us that this lifetime is sacred, it's special, don't waste it. Most people are, because they're selfishly chasing just their own personal desires. Now, that's okay. That's part of the plan, and you'll keep doing that for many lifetimes, but eventually you tire of it. It'll wear you down, you'll wear yourself down, and you'll start looking for alternatives. And that's where we all are at this point, and myself and you and all the listeners that are tuning in. He goes on to say that all our actions, whether they're physical, mental, or emotional, should become an offering, a sacrifice for the betterment of the universe and everything in it. Now that sounds an enormous task, isn't it? Yeah, saying, well, everything I'm thinking, saying, and doing for the benefit of the entire universe, all 8 billion people, all the stars and the moons and the planets, all the galaxies, everything. I'm supposed to be contributing to all of that. How can me, little old me, do any of that? Well, it's not as hard as it seems. You can do it. We are doing it already. We're just going to expand and understand why we're doing it and do it in a little bit more consistently and a little bit more frequently. So this is not as difficult.
And that reminder for everyone, start local, do what's in your close
Yeah,
proximity, and that
yeah,
radiates out.
yeah,
It is the contribution. If everyone is doing their own small thing, we're
yeah,
gradually
yeah,
improving the circles in which we move.
exactly. And as you're saying that, I think it comes to mind one of the current great masters, I think it was Gandhi, said, you be the change that you want to see in society. You know, people say, oh, the government should do this and so should do this and someone else should do that. No, no, no. They should all play their part, but you worry about playing your part, just exactly as you said, Jacqui, and you start changing. You start doing actions more in line with the betterment of all of society, which will be of great benefit to yourself. It's not just the rest of it. Don't leave yourself out. And that's how it all works. Yeah.
I think we all know, sorry to, but just another point came to mind. I think we all know that feeling of if you're in, say, a work office or a social space or something, and somebody comes in with like a foul mood or a foul temper, it sort of almost contaminates around, and not
Yes.
before too long, people are feeling a bit niggly and whatever. And then we also know the converse. You might all be part of a group and it's all just sort of plodding along and it's okay. And someone walks in and they're like a ray of sunshine, and all of a sudden they're uplifting everybody. So
Yeah.
we know the feeling.
Everyone can recognise that, Jacqui, can't they? Like, you obviously are fully aware of it. I'm fully aware of it. But this is what the teaching is. So this is going to help everyone. Doesn't mean you spring in and, hey, here I am and I'm a ray of light and, I'm going to rev you all up and all that. People do that, but that's okay. But everyone can do that just by playing their role according to truthful living. And so that way, consistently, all the time, you'll be a person that you will find. That's that notion of Nelson Mandela when he says, let your light shine, and it gives permission for others to let their light shine. So he's
Yes.
talking about operate truthfully according to divine law. People will be drawn to you, people will appreciate you, and you'll be doing what you're meant to be doing. Don't go seeking pats on the back and everyone, I hope everyone says I'm great and I'm the best person in the office and I'm the life of the party and all of these things. We all like those little sort of acknowledgements, but they can be an egoic trap, can't they?
Yes.
And people sort of live up to it, and they got the trap for any person operating from that is that they believe that they're the doer, that I'm doing all this, overlooking the fact that there's this higher force, this greater force that's fueling you as to what you do or not. And if you don't keep back, if you don't give back and act and use that source wisely, it'll start to dry up. It'll run out on you, if not in this lifetime, in coming lifetimes. We've got to keep remembering there's a bigger picture and recognizing that we're on a journey that's taking many, many lifetimes.
Yes.
All
I
right,
think
Jacqui?
another point worth mentioning just quickly is this thing of authenticity. And you touched on it too, but it's this thing of if we're acting truly in accord with what we, really feel and believe to be true and correct, people can discern that. So like you say, you can walk in and be pretending to be the life of the party, perhaps. Whereas if you're naturally just feeling that there's lightness or joy or something radiating from you, if you're responding to what you feel, what you know to be true and correct, people can also discern that. So it's not about trying hard to be the positive one or the this one or the that one. It's acting in accordance with your internal alignment and
Yeah,
congruency,
yeah,
which is also a path for people because actually we don't always know what's going on. So the path in is one aspect, and then responding and living from that is another component.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and again, you touched on it very well. Authenticity, in other words, being true, or pretending. And people, by and large, can very quick, or especially people that are more switched on, can pretty quickly tell the difference. But there are huge numbers of people, politicians, as I mentioned recently, we're having elections. They'll believe anything they're being told when there's elections. I'll promise you this and I'll promise you that, and I'll do this and I'll do that. But can't see through the falsity of a lot of those things. Some of those eventuate, of course, and I'd certainly like to see more promises actually come to fruition rather than just remain promises forever and ever and ever. Anyway, I'll get back to the material, Jacqui. So I just wanted to make a mention in our Christian teachings, this is very similar to the concept of thy will be done, not my will. So that's this notion of sacrificial action and egoic action performed by me, or performed in the aspect of Krishna's teachings, the Divine Lord, or and all the great masters refer to that. So we need to shift the focus from a totally selfish, ego-centered me and what's in it for me to a bigger picture. So there's, as I say, that reference in the Christian teachings very valid, and exactly the same as here. Thy will, meaning consciousness will, the Creator's will, be done, not my will. So we can't change the Creator's will. That's perfect, pure and complete. So the only thing, if there's any out of alignment with it, like we're there and we're wavering, or that's consciousness there and we're wavering here, well, eventually we've got to stop wavering and line up so that our consciousness, thy will and my will, are the same. All right? Beautiful hands, aren't they? Yeah.
I'm guessing you're looking at the clock, which is what I'm doing. So I'm hoping your teachings and summarising are going well.
We've got a long way to go, Jacqui.
Okay.
But I better get on with it and stop making funnies about my hands, which aren't really all that funny. Okay, serious now. So I'm quoting exactly directly from verse 17 here. Krishna states, the soul who meditates on the self, the higher self, him, is content to serve the self and rests satisfied within the self. There remains nothing more for him to accomplish. So this is the end result, if you like, of what will happen to a human being if they follow this teachings. And it's such a beautiful little verse, a little shloka. I'd like to read it once more. He says, the soul who meditates on the self is content to serve the self and rests satisfied within the self. There remains nothing more for him to accomplish. So it means end of journey, Jacqui, end of job. You've done what you're meant to do as a human being on this planet Earth. He urges Arjuna, which is us, of course, to do his duty truthfully, to be in the present, to meet the need, to operate from a state of equanimity. Do not be concerned with the outcome. Let your light shine so others can imitate you, and so on. This requires us acting from our higher self, using our buddhi, our organ of higher discrimination. Krishna makes a reference to King Janaka. This is not the same king that was in the banquet, but it's a similar one, who was an ancient Indian ruler, but who Arjuna admired. So he's using someone that Arjuna admires to use him, or his life, to illustrate to Arjuna that you ought to be doing the same as this person you admired, King Janaka. He says, he reminded him that King Janaka, while fully active in the world as a powerful ruler, so he's ruling millions of people, he's making all the decisions, and he's ruling the kingdom beautifully. Everyone's happy, everything's going according to the law. But that's because King Janaka is a realized being and operating from the truth. And so he's explaining to Arjuna that you can be both. You can be fully active in the world and still end up becoming realized. So he's saying, he reminded him that King Janaka, while fully active in the world as a powerful ruler, was able to attain perfection, enlightenment, through action. So it's either through action, we'll come to look at that there's three paths, three yogas. Path of action, there's the path of knowledge, and there's the path of devotion. But in the end, they're like rivers. They'll all come together in one mighty river, Jacqui, and and again, there'll be a whole chapter on that aspect as well. Next, Krishna briefly explains the role of the ego behind all of our actions. So I've been mentioning ego a lot in these podcasts, and I'll be mentioning them a lot in future podcasts because they're one of the enemy they're the enemy that lies within. It's very manipulative, it's very disguisive, camouflages itself. You don't easily spot it. At first you can once you start understanding, but even as your understanding grows, it grows more cunning, more devious, hard to spot, and therefore hard to stop. But anyway, so he's just explaining in a few brief sentences here that that's the ego behind all of our actions. And he says one of the things is not to identify with the performance or the outcome of the action. So like you mentioned before, people who try to pretend that they're the life of the party or they're really important or this or that. A lot of ego is driving a lot of those things. He says, and especially, be careful of the ego telling you you're the doer of this. This was your, all this was because of the actions and how you organised everything. It's all your brilliant idea. This claim to it's me. When there's I, me, or mine in the equation, Jacqui, it's an indication that ego is involved and there's a play in the person's life. And he also points out it's the ego which constantly wants to distract the seeker of truth from his teachings. So as people drop off from these podcasts, or as people leave my groups over the years, or as people start to listen, read some books, but then don't like it much or lose interest and go back to their everyday life. This was that crossroads situation I referred to a few podcasts back, when you're at a crossroads or whatever, you make a choice. Do I keep doing what I've always been doing, or am I going to be courageous enough to make a change, significant change, go in a different direction? And for the people who said, no, I'm not at a crossroads, or I don't feel I need to change, well, it was ego behind all of that. And that's all okay. They'll just continue on as they always have until the time comes when they don't want to do that anymore. But this is where we're all operating from. We've made the decision. I asked the people a few weeks back, if you remember, Jacqui, and they all told me that they were happy to make the decision and continue on this path. And I was delighted to hear that from them. So we continue on. So the topic now that I'll be finishing off over the next 10 or 15 minutes is all to do with desires. So I mentioned... So Krishna now concludes chapter 3 with some very, very firm and clear instructions regarding desires. Krishna's teachings, very firm, very clear, in about 10 or 15 shlokas in the text, all centered on this theme. And Jacqui, I referred to these in our last podcast when I briefly mentioned when we come to look at it, we'll come to understand how many desires actually reside within us, how many we have, how cunning ego can conceal them. We don't think that they're desires, but they are. Yeah, but ego sort of hides them. How they continuously dictate every thought, every word, every action that we perform every minute of every day of our lives. So they're very, very powerful, this whole aspect of actions and desires that drive the actions. Now, eventually we need to exhaust or eradicate all of our desires in order to purify ourselves. Now, instantly I would imagine there'll be people saying, oh, I can understand why I want to get rid of my bad desires, but surely you're not asking me to get rid of my good desires. Well, I'm not asking, but Krishna is suggesting you get rid of all desires. Yeah. You might want to hang on to the good ones for a while, but you'll remember that whether they're good or bad, good just means they're up here and bad means they're down here, but they're all going to keep you to some extent or other in bondage. So eventually we'll come to understand that more fully, so don't be too concerned at this stage. I'll continue on. So Arjuna now asks, my Lord, and this is a direct quote from the Gita, my Lord, tell me, what is it that drives a man to sin, even against his will, and as if by compulsion? So he's saying, why do I say things or do things that even as I'm doing them, I realise I really shouldn't, or saying them, or after I've done them or said them, I have regrets and so on. Yeah. So he says, my Lord, tell me, what is it that drives a man to sin, even against his will, and as if by compulsion? And I'll go straight to his answer in a minute, but I just want to clear up the word sin briefly. The word sin in this context, because people have a connotation, Jacqui, that is to do with religion, go to confession and you've made a mortal sin or this or that. But in this context, in the teachings of the Gita and in all the great works, anytime sin's mentioned, it simply means the person's operating from untruth. That's the sin. It's a separateness from God. The only sin that exists in that sense of the word is to what degree you separate yourself from God or the higher source. And the more you separate yourself from the higher source, the greater the actual sins, whether they're murder or rape or stealing or drug dealing or whatever, they get lesser and greater. But that's all because of the original sin. That's the concept of the original sin, separating yourself from God. So the word sin in this context means operating from untruth. When we act in this world against our own conscience, our minds become disturbed and agitated. We act unwisely, we regret it, and then feel bad, suffering remorse and guilt. So all of those aspects of sorry and I wish I hadn't and, blame and all of this all come from that egoic aspect, all fueled by desires. So Krishna now clearly and firmly immediately replies to Arjuna's questions. And again, I'm going to be quoting in detail from the actual words of Krishna in these next few slokas. So Krishna replies, when a man dwells on the objects of sense, he creates an attraction to them. Attraction develops into desire, and desire breeds frustration and anger. Anger induces delusion. Delusion, loss of memory. Through loss of memory, reason, which is our buddhi, is shattered, and loss of reason leads to man's destruction. Powerful words, Jacqui, powerful words. This applies to every human being on the planet. I'm just going to quickly read those 4 lines again. Attraction. When a man dwells on the objects of senses, he creates an attraction for them. Attraction develops into desire, and desire breeds frustration and anger. Anger induces delusion. Delusion, loss of memory. Through loss of memory, reason is shattered, and loss of reason leads to destruction. And I'm going to just show quickly here, Jacqui, for anyone that actually watches the podcast as well as listening. There's a picture here in the Gita that shows that. Can you see that? Can everyone see that, Jacqui?
Yes,
so it shows up here. A man spots an attractive lady. He's attracted to her. They meet and get friendly and so on. This is sort of spiraling down to this aspect of self-destruction that he's talking about at the end, okay? And then he spots the young lady that he's been interested in the arms of another man. And so jealousy and frustration and anger and so on arise in him. And so you can sort of see there he's having a heated argument. It looks quite violent and vicious and that. And, there's all this confusion and loss of mind. His mind's twirling around and then it shows snakes and demons in the end. And I'll read you the paragraph from this writer's comment on the bottom of the page, and it's exactly all these are exactly the same. He says, while contemplating the objects of senses, a person develops attachment for them. From such attachments comes lust, then anger, illusion, bewilderment of memory, and loss of intelligence. And then one falls down into the material cycle of birth and death. So these repeated patterns of behaviour keep us locked into the hell of lives and deaths. We think they're good, we love them, in the times that we need them, because we've got to have them to finally discover our true nature. But in the end, we realise that this whole creation is what's called an illusion. And because we're only wanting to operate and understand the real, which is not an illusion, because illusions come and go and change, but the real's permanent and never changes. We eventually, that'll be as we gain more knowledge and as we perfect ourselves more on our spiritual journey, that'll be our ultimate goal, and we'll eventually be done with life cycles and wheels of birth and death. So
just quickly, sorry to interrupt, but drawing your attention to the time, Michael,
yes,
that we'll be looking at wrapping up comments.
Okay. Thank you. Lord Sri Krishna goes on to say, this is his final little comment, it's desire and its aversion, so positive and negative, born of passion. Desire consumes and corrupts everything. It is a man's greatest enemy. This desire-anger duo force is your most formidable enemy here on earth. He says your desires cloud your spiritual light. They bury your power of discrimination, your buddhi, and as a fire is covered in smoke and a mirror by dust and an embryo hidden by the womb, so is this universe enveloped in desire. It is the wise man's constant enemy. It tarnishes the face of wisdom. It's as insatiable as a flame of fire. If we want to put a fire out, Jackie, a fire in our lounge room or bonfire or anything, we stop throwing logs of wood on it, don't we? That's the only way you can put a fire out, no more fuel to burn. Similarly, if we want to put the fire of desire out, we've got to stop putting logs of desire onto our own fire. I want to quickly refer to one of my favourite songs. My two favourite musics are country and western. Johnny Cash, you might remember Johnny Cash. He sang some country and western songs. One of my favourites, and I didn't know for a long time because I never really listened to the words. But one day when I was driving in to take a group, I stopped at a set of traffic lights and it was on the radio, and I actually listened to the words. We'll listen to how Johnny Cash describes desires. I can see you smiling, Jackie, because you've heard my reference to this over the years. So Johnny Cash's song, Ring of Fire, and I'm sure many of you have heard of it, captures this sentiment beautifully, but you might not have listened to the words. So listen to the words. He sings, bound by wild desire, I fell into a ring of fire. Down, 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 the flames leapt higher. The ring of fire, the ring of fire. So that's describing exactly what Krishna's teachings, that the more we fall into our own hell of desires, the greater the heat is. So put simply, by constantly running after or running away from desires, we create our own hell. We dial the heat up or down. We say, I've had a hell of a day. Often we say that, don't we, Jackie? Something's happened at work, something's happened in the family situation. Oh, geez, it's been a bastard of a day. It's been a hell of a day. Other days we say, I feel like I'm in heaven. So this is all the ups and downs that we create through whatever we're doing in regards acting, all based on the desires. And I just want to show a little picture on that, Jackie, in the same sort of person scooter. That's all pretty obvious, isn't it? So there's the person there. Johnny Cash says, bound by wild desires, these are all consuming. The desires will burn you. They'll burn you in the end. They'll burn you to a cinder. So we need to avoid them. And so I'd like this has worked out beautifully, Jackie. My timing's spot on.
Your timing's a little over, actually, Michael. I think you might have forgotten our agreed finishing time.
Yeah, but I think we started a few minutes later.
Okay.
I just want to finish off with 2 minutes of a quote and the exercise for the day.
Clearly, everyone can see the enthusiasm for the teaching. They could be spoken about for a long time.
There's so much in this teaching, Jackie. I feel a bit frustrated in that there's so much more I could say and want to say, and Krishna says, but I know we don't have time. But anyway, bear with me because this is, I think, a lovely note that everyone will appreciate.
Yes.
So there's a lovely quote from the Upanishads regarding the senses that I'd like to share here, Jackie, to finish off before I give our listeners their exercise for the week. Beautiful works in the Upanishads, they're precise. He says, God made senses turn out, man therefore looks out. Every now and again, a daring soul, desiring immortality, stops and looks within. This is all our listeners, Jacqui. The whole world is looking out there, listening out there, touching out there, smelling out there, tasting out there. Stop all that. Bring it down to manageable levels, because that's where the whole focus is, and put some of that energy and time and effort into looking within. Yeah. Listen to the words, desire a daring soul. So all of us that are listening and working on this at the stage of our lives, in whatever podcast you're listening to and whatever, but that's what you are. You're a daring soul, and you're desiring immortality eventually, but in the meantime, you're desiring happiness and joy and contributing to society. Okay, Jacqui? And the exercise for the week, I think, will be pretty obvious to everyone. Whenever you remember, I'd like you to try and observe what was the desire behind what you were thinking, what you were saying, and what you were doing. Anytime you remember, ask yourself, what was behind what I was just saying? What was behind what I was just doing? Have a deeper, meaningful look to see if it's coming from your higher self, a genuine contribution to the welfare of your fellow man and yourself and the entire universe, or is it coming from a small, narrow, egoic aspect? All right, Jacqui. In other words, what was your motive? What's the intention?
That's an excellent exercise, and that really could be an exercise for life, not just 1 week. But anyway, week by week, something to focus upon.
These exercises aren't just for the week. Try and keep them going from week to week to week, from day to day, from minute to minute. That's right, Jacqui.
Yeah,
all right,
beautiful.
Folks, I'm done and dusted.
Yeah, we are indeed. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Lovely to connect, and we will see you next week. Bye.